this is something that I've wanted to see for a while. There's a lot of really cool stuff around application frameworks that's been happening in Ruby. The thing that brought a lot of us to Ruby was Ruby on Rails, and just because it was such a cool framework and allowed us to do so much more with so much less. And since then, there's been a lot of other very cool frameworks that have been developed, and we have the authors and contributors to some of the really most interesting ones, in my opinion. Are we playing with my level here? Maybe this isn't the best spot for me. It's always the feedback issue. So the vision I had was to just get the authors and the people behind the frameworks together and let them have an hour to talk about what made Ruby good, what made Ruby not so good for doing frameworks. Because I've been a big fan of frameworks for a while. I think it's where it's at. And as far as I'm concerned, a problem domain without a framework is just not something that's going to get much traction in the world. So let me do some introductions here. I'm going to stand back here so I'm out of the speaker range to help you out. Okay, so we have Tim Elliott representing Shoes, the framework created by Why the Lucky Stiff, and Greg Bornstein talking about the Ruby Arduino development framework. Jay Phillips, who's the author of the Adhearsion telephony framework. Blake Mizrani, talking about Sinatra, which you heard about this morning. Yehuda Katz, representing Merb, even though he's on the... Kind of. And Josh Peak of the Rails core team, here representing Rails. So, of course, Merb and Rails have gotten together recently, so that might make for a... Notice the two of them are down there at the end together, so maybe it'll be...
Somehow the web framework guys ended up on this side. And
yeah, how'd that happen?
The weird guys are on this side.
Okay, so we don't have another wired mic, do we?
The guys working with real hardware.
Okay, so I think I'm going to go to the back of the room to try and deal with the feedback issue. Luckily, I'm untethered here, so I can do that. And we're going to start things off. Each of the panelists is going to take a couple minutes and introduce their framework and their position about Ruby as a vehicle for building frameworks. So let's just start on the left with Tim, and we'll go down as we go down across the stage.
All right. So my name is Tim. I've been a contributor to Shoes since the end of December. It was quite new for me to contribute actually to an open source project, and it's been quite an experience because through GitHub it's really easy to fork a project, and putting your code out there for the first time is actually kind of scary. And this has kind of introduced me to a lot of new things, C, programming, also public speaking, which I'm usually pretty scared of. But one thing about Shoes that I've noticed here is that the people I've talked to about it are very, very receptive to it, and it's a very fun kind of framework. Shoes is a framework for creating GUI applications. It's a toolkit. It's it's actually an application that embeds Ruby, so it's not in itself written in Ruby. It's written mostly in C. Shoes is made to be fun. It's made to kind of lower the barrier to programming by making it super easy to create fun applications. So it's really easy in Shoes to draw shapes and to make animations. And in recent releases, you can even make music really easily in Shoes. And it's also not an MVC framework. So creating an application in Shoes, you actually it's pretty much like writing a script often. You just kind of you often only use one file, and it's quite straightforward. Let's see, what else about Shoes? One thing that sets Shoes apart is because it's written to be compiled and shared with your friends as actually an installer. What often actually happens is your code actually runs on other people's machines. So most of the web frameworks, you're writing a web application that will serve HTML and run in somebody else's browser, but in this case, you actually have Ruby running on another person's machine, and it's a little bit more unpredictable that way because people have different operating systems and different libraries installed. So that's something that makes Shoes kind of unique and gives Shoes kind of its own challenges as a framework. And finally, related to that, Ruby is primarily actually used in because it's used on developer machines, and because it's used for web frameworks, it's primarily used on Unix environments. And though it does run in Windows, there are a lot of challenges that Shoes runs into, because you actually in the end then have to run it in a Windows environment. And final challenge that Shoes runs into is that because it's a GUI toolkit, it has a main loop, and that's actually constantly running. And because Ruby uses green threads, whenever the operating system hits an I/O, say it's doing web access or disk access, it can actually pause your main loop, and it can pause your application. So even though you might be using Ruby threads in your application, because they're green and because they're not real operating system threads, it can bring your GUI to a halt. And I guess I'll pass it on.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm Greg Bornstein, and my framework is called Ruby Arduino Development, or RAD for short. And so the Arduino is an open source hardware platform for doing like hardware hacking. So you can very easily program physical devices that take input from sensors and output actuators and cause things to move and jump and blink and make noise and stuff. So it's an open source project based off of the processing project, which is a similar project for GUI. Is actually a spiritual predecessor to Shoes in a lot of ways. You code in C++, and they've got like actually a pretty good, very usable library in C++. But I wanted to do it in Ruby, both to make it even easier for newcomers, like I was at the time, to hardware programming, microcontroller programming, to be able to get started, and also just to get rid of a lot of the like overhead and boilerplate that comes from that stuff of configuration. So Ruby is great for that. RAD uses a set of Rails-like conventions for doing some of that configuration to make stuff really easy. And then there's a project called Ruby to C that some of the Seattle RB guys, Eric Hodel mainly, wrote, which will just take Ruby code and do its best effort to output C that corresponds to it. And so I use that combined with a bunch of code generation, and then hand off the result as if it was a C++ program that you'd written to the Arduino tool chain to get compiled and uploaded with their tools. One thing I think maybe is in common with a lot of frameworks is, unlike some other code with a framework, you tend to sit in the middle of a whole ecosystem of code that, where, beyond your borders, there's a lot of dragons of code that you don't understand. Like for me, having, AVR GCC 1 or 2 hops away from code I'm generating, or Ruby to C, which is a giant kind of piece of alien technology that I have a little bit of knowledge on the outside of, but that's one factor. So you sit in this, you have things above you and below you in the stack. And then for me, I came to this hardware hacking stuff as a Ruby programmer, wanting to learn about that. So there's a lot of, I have contributors to my project who are like old school, C hardware guys who build stuff, and they submit code and plugins to my project that, I have a hard time evaluating the quality of, but for many reasons, because the C code is sometimes beyond me. I don't have the actual physical hardware I need to even run their code. Testing gets to be a hard environment for me, because you need literally a desk full of hardware to run all of the plugins and things that we have. We're working on a test suite that will come with a shoebox full of hardware that you have to plug in, and you run the tests and things blink and beep and move, and if that happens in the right order, then the test pass. But it can be really hard. I think that's another thing. Probably I'm interested to hear how some of the other frameworks deal with that. You started your project first to scratch your own itch often, or to do a specific set of things that you want to do, and then people extend it to do things that you're not against, but you maybe have no use for yourself, or in my case, can't actually do without the hardware. And that can cause a lot of challenges. Also, another thing with RAD is it started really pretty simply, and then I added contributors and they started doing these more complicated things, it grew in complexity really fast. In a way, like I always feel like I'm only just have my arms around how RAD actually works. Like as new people add things to it and add chunks of functionality, I'm constantly trying to refactor them into something that makes sense to me and is a little cleaner. And so you kind of have the like multiple cooks in the kitchen, and you get a stew like when you'd make when you were a little kid and just would put all the liquids into a pot and boil it. Danger. So beauty of code is a real challenge, especially like RAD has to run in a bunch of weird environments because it has a build process that basically runs in a set of rake tasks, and so it's just like we have some ugliness that we're constantly trying to fight because of that.
Okay.
So I'm curious to hear how the other guys solve some of those kind of things.
Howdy. So let me start off and say that all of you guys should go to sparkfun.com right now and buy an Arduino. It is so fun. Pick up some LEDs. You can get like a little hello world blinky 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 thing going on, and it'll really sort of like take your Ruby skills to a new level and sort of satisfy the sort of hacker curiosity that I think a lot of people here share. I'm Jay Phillips, the creator of Adhearsion, and Adhearsion is basically a way of building back-end telephony applications. And when you look at me, you probably don't think of telephony developer. I don't have like a neck beard and like, I'm not like 20 years older than probably the average in the industry. But I had that hacker curiosity and was a web developer, knew Rails, wanted to basically get into telephony development. Telephony development because it was one of those like foreign technologies that I knew that I could do if I tried, and just wanted to do it over a couple weeks and try it out. And actually one of the first things that I did with my framework was hook it up to an Arduino so that I could call into it and basically control via RF an Arduino across my apartment to unlock my doors by calling in and entering a key code. So that's an example of telephony development. That's an example of Arduino development that's completely different from web development and totally badass. So I encourage all of you guys to sort of think out of the box and experiment with weird technologies. Telephony is one of several weird technologies that you can play with. To talk a little bit about Adhearsion itself, it's basically a framework in its own right. It's not like a Rails plugin. It's not like an iPhone app or like an iPhone framework. It's like back-end telephony development. So you call into a phone number and you have Ruby code basically service the phone call. It's doing real-time call control, so like playing stuff and recording stuff and so forth. So a lot of people ask the question of like, okay, do I need like specific hardware for that? Adhearsion basically rusts above something called Asterisk. How many of you guys have heard of Asterisk before? Wow, that's crazy. Okay, so how many of you guys have heard of Adhearsion before? So it sounds like the same number of people. So Asterisk, Adhearsion actually rusts above a couple of different things. Asterisk being the main one because of just demand. There are way more Asterisk developers than any of the other projects. And Asterisk has a couple different options of servicing phone calls. So you can have basically like a pure VoIP phone call to another peer on the internet, and that's just like a UDP protocol basically that doesn't require any special hardware. You can run it pretty much anywhere. There are a couple complicated things, like if you do conferencing, then you might need some special hardware for timing devices, but not in all cases. And you can hook an Asterisk box up to like an analog phone line, or if you get fancy, like a phone line from your telco that has many different channels in it. And for that, you do need special hardware. You can buy it online. It's a PCI card, pop it in, install the driver, and it works with Asterisk or FreeSwitch or whatever. So about Ruby, I think to me one of the most interesting things about Ruby is the ability to sort of like play with other people's code. So you can, like, one of the, like, Adhearsion basically has a plugin system. The plugin system has changed a lot. It was actually created for that Arduino project, but it's the newest version of it, which I'm totally excited about. Basically, I think exemplifies the dynamism of Ruby and why it's valuable. You can basically like module eval some code into an anonymous module, and then it sort of collects all these anonymous modules that have been sort of like picked up from the file and directory conventions, and then sort of like, you know, extends objects in the future with with this basically a collection of anonymous modules, so that they can sort of like be extended with features from a bunch of different files. And I think the reason why I bring that up is because that is such a profound technology if you think about it. The amount of, you know, for that to work, you have to have, you know, like singleton classes and anonymous modules, and, you know, like in Ruby we have the conventions of, you know, file and directory paths, and I think that all of the conventions that I think a lot of us will talk about sort of converge on a very familiar paradigm that fits many applications, and telephony is one of them, and I hope to talk about that and cheerlead for the underserviced technology. By the way, my last point, at a philosophical level, Adhearsion is basically trying to bring open source software and bring modern software development principles to a very backward, very unkept industry. The telephony industry is very, very old school. There's lots of inertia, and there's lots of room for bright people, especially in the Ruby space, to come in and change the game. And like I said, it's one of the last frontiers of open source software, and, you know, it's fighting the good fight, and I hope I can convince some of you guys to try it out. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Blake Mazzarini, the creator of Sinatra. How many of you have heard of Sinatra? You as well. You all saw us talk this morning. That's why. All right. Yeah, I don't know. I created Sinatra because I had, like you know, Greg said, I had an itch. I needed speed, and it just, I don't know. I didn't like. Well, let me back up here. I'm a big fan of MVC, but I'm a strong believer that it's not for everything, and it's not for every web project. And I had this itch that MVC was far too much. I had a couple routes. I needed a back-end web service, and so Sinatra was born. And I think, and to get into the part about why Ruby was so great for Sinatra, was closures. So I'm a really, I love closures. Closures are fun. They're cool, and you can do some really crazy tricks with them. And I thought that was like a really cool way to really kind of like style a framework would be to create a DSL, which closures allow us to do in Ruby. So Sinatra was born, and I think it's really had a pretty strong influence in the Ruby community. Some frameworks have tried to emulate it, but it's great. I mean, it is a micro framework in the truest sense of the word. It's less than like 800 lines of code right now. And it's getting smaller. So, and we're pushing more and more stuff is getting introduced to RAD core, so we're able to pull a lot of code out of Sinatra and use and leverage RAD more. So, and I guess another point we like to make is that Sinatra, we like to say it's a really strong RAC citizen. It relies heavily on RAC and exposes RAC to the user and to the developer. We don't hide it from you. It's very strong at doing very complex pieces or more complicated pieces of middleware. You can stick it in front of a Rails app if you need a little more oomph. You can use it as a background. You can put it in your gems. It's become very versatile, and I don't know. I love it. So anyway, that's about it.
Hey, Yehuda. I didn't create Merb, but I worked on it as the lead maintainer for a year-ish. I'm not going to talk about Merb or Rails because I think people know what that is. I'll just talk about Ruby's impact and framework stuff. So I think the hardest thing about actually maintaining a framework is that frameworks start off with a really strong sense of identity. Merb had pretty strong sense, Rails also. And then what ends up happening is that people build apps with it and people say, oh, that API, I really feel like this application-specific thing that I want to do should be supported by this generic API. And actually looking at those requests and figuring out whether it's really somebody trying to push their application code into the framework or whether it's adequately generic to be supported in the framework, I think is really tricky. It's something that both Rails and Merb have struggled with a lot, and I assume the rest of these folks. Just because it's easy, it's very easy, and when you can tell weak periods of a framework are when there's a lot of things in there that you're like, whoever needed that? Like, it's like one guy ever needed that piece of code. And yet it's something that has to be supported forever into the future because a few people use it and will complain. And it actually requires a lot of will to remove things. About Ruby itself, I think probably the best thing about Ruby is that all code is executed code. That's kind of not something we normally think about when we think about what Ruby is good at. But the fact that every line of Ruby is just a piece of executed code means that you can define methods anywhere in your application and have them do things, and then that's really powerful. What's hard about Ruby is that Ruby's not a slow language, but Ruby is a language where nothing is free. So unlike in C, where if you have an if statement that doesn't do anything, that's pretty free relative to a lot of other things. I mean, probably if I talk to a C hacker, they'll say, no, you could optimize that, but things are pretty free. In Ruby, like instance variable access, hash access, things that most people think of as relatively free, like in your application, in frameworks really add up. So in an application, you can say, okay, I'm writing this application. I don't have to check for this weird edge case. In frameworks, as you start adding support for a lot of cases, you end up with a lot of code that is just testing to see if somebody's application case is being used in this place. And so figuring out a way using Ruby to basically compile down and say, okay, I know, in callbacks, for instance, I know that this, I already know this is a symbol, or I already know that this does not use an if condition, so I won't bother to check. That starts to get really tricky. And if you don't do a lot of really crazy not going to use French words, mind warping things, you end up with code that slowly eats away at performance because you have to constantly do checks for things that would otherwise be free in other languages. So the hard part about frameworks is just you have to support a lot of generic things and there's not a lot of free things. The great thing is all code is executed, so it's really easy to add DSLs for people.
I'm Joshua Peak. I'm in the Rails core, and I'm also part of the Rack core as well. And I'm mainly responsible for implementing Rack in 2.3 that was just released. When I started working on the integration for Rack in 2.3, the thing I like most about Rack is even though it's a port of Python's WSGI, because of Ruby, Ruby puts its own spin on Rack, and WSGI, I think they kind of like split up the methods, and like you have like a start response and a end response and a bunch of really nasty wrappers. Like in Ruby, you can really distill the API down to just a call, an environment hash, which is really nice. It's really simple and shows the power of Ruby. Let's see. So going forward in Rails 3.0, as we all know, we're Rack and Merb and Rails are emerging. Things I'm looking forward to are figuring out how we can share code between other frameworks. I mean, before the rack integration started before the whole Merb thing, so I was really interested beforehand how Rails and Merb can share code. But even though that's irrelevant now, I'm still looking forward to how we can share code between any rack application. So if you write middleware that works on Rails, can work on Sinatra, can work on any other Ruby framework. So I think that's strengthening the Ruby the ecosystem of web frameworks.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're gonna take questions from the audience in a little bit, but I'm going to start off with one or two of my own. Let me see. The first one is probably a couple of you have touched on this. But I'll give some others a chance to chime in too. And that's, what do you think is the language feature about Ruby that is most helpful in implementing a framework?
I'm going to go with meta classes and closures. I mean, being able to do DSL-like things, like I think Active Record was probably one of the that always comes to mind in a lot of people's mind when they think of like the original DSLs. But that really brought forth and shined the light on how we can, do things like has many and has one and those kinds of cool little tricks with the language. So, I mean, that's my vote.
Yeah, I don't actually consider languages without closures to be very powerful languages in general. I already talked about executable code, which I think is the equivalent to the macro thing. But yeah, closures. I always forget when I'm talking about Ruby because I also live in JavaScript land half the time, and JavaScript has really powerful closures, so it's not really a differentiating feature. But outside of Ruby and JavaScript, and to some degree Python and a couple of other new languages, a ton of languages that probably most programmers in the world use don't have them at all, and that's really painful.
What Yehuda mentioned earlier about being able to like define and undefined methods on the fly, like RAD wouldn't be possible without that, because we're going to hand off a class to Ruby to C to translate methods, but we don't want it to do every method on the class. We need to kind of craft this class with just the methods we actually want to be turned into C code. So like the Arduino is a little bit similar in certain ways to Shoes. Like it's a loop. Once the code's actually running on the hardware, it runs in a loop. And so there's a setup method that runs once and a loop that runs over and over again, and then whatever helper methods the user wrote. And so we want just those to get translated, whereas we might have a Ruby class with, lots of methods that we use in the process to create configuration and do lots of other stuff. So being able to grab that and like rip the guts out of it at the last minute and just get things just how we want them wouldn't be possible without the really powerful method definition and undefinition and evaling properties of Ruby.
I would have to say open classes are really nice, even though not everyone agrees, but it's really nice if you look at active support, all the goodies that it adds to Rails. It's sometimes weird when you open up like a fresh Rails app and I don't require active support. I feel like I'm missing so many other little helpers in it. So open classes is really nice.
Yeah, I also want to add something not intuitive, which is community, but I don't mean the community is awesome. I mean the rack thing that happened is actually something that doesn't happen in communities much, which is basically a grassroots, everybody agrees that when we make web apps, we're going to support a lot, we're going to share a lot of the same code. If you look in the Python community, WSGI is not supported by Django, really. I mean, Django works with WSGI, but they have their own middleware and whatnot. They try to do their own thing. And just getting to a point where everybody who makes web frameworks in Ruby is agreeing that we're all going to share the same session code, we're all going to share the same adapters, et cetera, is fairly massive. And I think it's something that the community of Ruby offers, which is that we really like sharing code. We really like using each other's code. That's a feature of Ruby that makes our frameworks more powerful than a lot of other languages.
To continue that thought, I think there's a lot of technological benefits to Ruby, but there's also the community, and I think that's something that all of us probably acknowledge, is that Ruby has one of the best communities, I think, of any programming language. And Ruby Gems is a great example. Whenever GitHub came out, virtually a big part of the bell curve, I think, of the Ruby people switched over to Git and GitHub, even though they may have never tried Git before they went to GitHub. So that sort of agility that allows sort of really the entire community to just sort of like, you can sort of think of it as like I hate to say this analogy, but like a school of fish. If you see like a school of fish like just darting around, that's really how we are, and we can do like a Tron like right turn like at any point and go chase something new and exciting. A lot of us are on Macs, a lot of us use Git, a lot of us use GitHub. It's really strange if you think about it, and I think it's certainly a good thing about the community, and I think RSpec is another great example how a lot of people come to Ruby without any experience doing test-driven development, and they come and they see a culture sort of like built up around it. They get into it, and there are even crazy projects out there like RSpec was pretty crazy when it came out, and now we have Cucumber, and it's going to get better and better, and I think that something like that is only possible within the Ruby community to the extent that it's succeeded so far.
Also, Ruby has brought in amazing people who are very creative, such as Why the Lucky Stiff, who he's like my hero. He's incredibly creative. He's an artist and a programmer, and something to aspire to.
I would also attribute the agility of the community to the agility of the language. When RSpec came out, RSpec was able to easily, well, not easily, but was able to actually hook into Rails in a way that, frankly, would just not be possible in Java, for instance. And pretty much all the changes are due to the fact that Ruby, the language, has very good evolutionary properties of being able to make a lot of little mutations very quickly without having to ask a lot of permission, and then the little mutations win, the winning ones win quickly. And whereas in a lot of other languages you're forced to make these large feedback loop mutations that just take forever, and so making really small, okay, I can easily shim that, is something that makes the community do the things that everyone said.
Okay, so let's see, fix my level there. To follow up on that, you've all talked about community, and which I think makes total sense, and there's definitely something there that even non-Rubyists talk about. I'm curious. I think all of your. Are we good? Okay, I'll be way in the back here. I think all the frameworks we're talking about today are open source frameworks, right? So, is there anything about Ruby in particular that you think, particularly encourages open source contributions or interactions? I mean, aside from GitHub.
The fact that it's a scripting language. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to hide your code away, and I think that actually helps.
So everything is open and revealed all the time.
Pretty much. I mean, there are ways of getting around it, but it's it's certainly not available in the community to a large extent. I think Five Runs has a proprietary thing that they did, but it's not. And a lot of people just don't even want to do it. They'd rather sign an NDA and that's it. So, but I think just being a scripting language has been actually across all scripting languages, not just Ruby. That's been a huge supporter of the open source mindset.
Okay, what else?
I would also, there's two things. One, I think the fact that Rails and Ruby established an MIT licensed thing. Actually, so in GPL licensed communities, the corporate world doesn't get involved in the open source. So whereas in Ruby, almost everything is corporate friendly. So big corporations end up using it, and even if maybe only 20% of the corporations ever bother giving back, that's still better than 0% of corporations ever using GPL licensed stuff. And also the fact that in Ruby it's really easy to take existing software that's open source and not have to apply a patch to it in order to make changes. I think really encourages people to just put anything out there. It's there, and if you want it, you don't have to go do any surgery. You can you can just monkey patch it and get back to the guy with a patch eventually without there being really formal protocols for how to take software that's open source and make it work with each other well.
And they're usually tests too, so that you can know if you're breaking shit.
Yes, testing is.
Do you think that the extensibility of the language interpreter itself has an effect? Being able to do C extensions to MRI? Is that a barrier in some places that it doesn't exist here?
I think JRuby, the extensibility of JRuby is great. you can sort of write some Java code and throw it into your JRuby application. I think that's more valuable than writing C extensions, honestly.
Okay.
That feels like something that's kind of coming more now to Ruby. That's part of the interoperability story. Is like C extensions as a way to interoperate with existing code, like a huge universe of existing code, and seeing things like JRuby and Rubinius and other projects are just bringing whole new worlds of interoperability, which helps with that.
I think it's kind of interesting that all the like JRuby, MacRuby, et cetera, all have really good interoperability stories. It seems like when you make a Ruby implementation on top of another language, it's sort of expected that there's reasonably or really good integration with the host language. And so if you have existing code in some foo language, there's an increasing chance now that there's a Ruby that you can easily interoperate with that thing.
A funny footnote to the open source story actually is Ruby to C, the project that without which you couldn't do RAD, is an offshoot of a project that the StatLRB guys did, which was MetaRuby, which was kind of a predecessor to Rubinius. And the business case for that, it wasn't the motivation, but the business case was obfuscating code in Ruby. So being able to ship closed source projects in Ruby with obfuscated code. So.
Okay, I'd like to take a couple questions from the audience. So who's got questions here? Can you maybe you can just speak loudly? Mislav?
So you guys all write frameworks, and it also has abstractions with active support for core extensions, right? So I think for me, except Rails and Sinatra, they really manage to support other different projects. You guys ended up there. So do you have libraries core extensions supporting the framework? And if you do you all see yourselves sharing the same library in the future? Because there's this active support, you don't have to code all of it. It's like
Okay, so to repeat for the let me repeat the question. The question was, Rails has active support. Do any of the other frameworks over there have that same kind of library of enabling functionality? And
Adhearsion uses active support by default, and I foresee that I'll be using all of active support in the future. Probably the same with Rails too. But I will say that that it does introduce sort of a moving part that I've had at least one bug because of, and that's basically whenever Adhearsion requires active support, it doesn't require a particular version; it just pulls in the latest version. But Adhearsion has a way of loading in a Rails app as well. And sometimes the Rails app will be for an older version of Rails. It'll try to activate a particular version of Active Record, which tries to activate a particular version of Active Support, but the latest one will already be loaded. So that's an example of like, okay, we need to fix like this Ruby gems problem because it's really annoying because you have like version mismatches like that. And
that's one of the things.
That's my rant about active support with a framework. And
one of the things for active support in 3.0, we're working on splitting up little so you can have just pick, like right now you said you can pick some features out of active support, but it's not that easy because you don't know what dependencies. Like if you require one particular core extension, it might have a dependency on others. So we're working on splitting that up so you can active support it'll be easier to just pick what you need out of it. So other frameworks who don't want the entire active support library can just pick out what they need.
Yeah, so Merb has, for the reason that Josh just mentioned, Merb had created a library in concert with DataMapper and some other frameworks called XLib, which was supposed to be a faster and more extensible, smaller active support. The goal as part of the merge is to make it possible for Merb in the future to just use active support. And DataMapper also is interested in just using active support. Precondition, of course, is that we actually do what we are going to do for Rails 3, which is make it really easy to pick and choose. I would also say about that gem thing, yes, that is the most evil problem in Ruby right now, and I think we have it licked. So in case people who have experienced that problem, the solution is actually to just write code that can take any number of dependencies and figure out magically what you need. And it's hard, and I think we have it licked. So hopefully RubyGems 1.4 will come with something like gem.resolve, a bunch of dependencies, and return back a list.
I was going to say, Sinatra has a nice little extension API so that you can create plugins. But the nice thing about it is that you're basically just including a module. So you should just be able to just as easily use that in Rails, and you'd be able to vice versa take in like what the work that they're doing and then just include that module in using the extension API and with a nice little bit of sugar, and so they should be able to operate back and forth. So, and if they don't, we accept patches.
Yeah, the hardest problem, of course, is the global space. Just that there is one global space, and I think Ruby is growing, and we're also, I think, seeing some growing pains with regard to the existence of one global space, and we're going to have to solve the problem, but we can buy ourselves a little time by trying to make active support something more people can use without pain, because that way more people will just use active support and less people will write other core extensions, and we can try to figure out how to solve the larger problem.
In the case of shoes, it's mostly C API interaction with like operating system and other toolkits such as GTK and on OS X. So for that reason, it hasn't needed much in terms of active support.
Okay. We have a question here.
So frameworks have some pretty unique constraints in that they need to be modular and reusable in various contexts. And I'm wondering what kinds of design challenges that presents. I know Yehuda's talked about maintaining stable APIs. We're finding on RSpec that there's no separation between the DSL layer and the library, and that makes the internal code bad. What are some of the design challenges you guys are facing with these frameworks?
That's a really good question. Ryan Tomeko and myself were talking about this for the 1.0 release of Sinatra, and Ryan had brought up a really good point, which was we were constantly saying, and trying to talk about what we wanted in Sinatra 1.0, and then at some point it just kind of like clicked, and he said, no, actually, what don't we want in Sinatra 1.0? And because we realized that at 1.0, like there's that challenge that it's now 1.0, and we can't change things as easily, without breaking the API. So if we trim things out now, we can always re-add them back later. But then the part is, what don't we want, right? Because everything's fun and interesting and has its place, but that's definitely a challenge is trying to come up with that.
On RAD, we have a kind of interesting version of this problem, which is that there's a whole ecosystem in the Arduino world of writing. There's not really plugins, but it's like sets of libraries that do something, and then we wrap those. And so there's kind of a balancing act of some we can provide that functionality in a way that feels a little bit more natively Ruby, but often involves like a bunch of code separate from the C++ version in Arduino. Or we have two extension APIs basically. One where you just install the Arduino library and then you have to write a custom wrapper. The other one where you can get it just more directly. And that's, I think, a bad decision. I'm trying to pick just one of those two. I'm basically trying to, I'd really like to go towards a route where you can point at a URL where the Arduino extension lives and like the set of libraries and just get it and have it work. And keep as much of that out of the framework as I possibly can. But it's really hard because that code can do lots of different stuff. And sometimes it's really ugly and you wanna kind of simplify it. But yeah, that's a really tricky subject for me because we have our own plugin API and there's the Arduino extensions that we support as well. That can involve having to compile all kinds of extra directories and like can change whole parts of the process that aren't just the actual framework. You can write assembler in line in a RAD class, and we add it to the makefile and like put it, stick your assembler code somewhere, and it becomes object files, and you can run it and stuff like that. And that has different problems than some of the other plugin architectures do, I think.
I would say I work on JavaScript frameworks as well, and probably the biggest thing that I've learned over the past couple of years is just if you write frameworks, you should write them in a way where you're doing what you expect your plugin people to do. So instead of having like massive secret awesome internal APIs so that you write your whole framework in, and then by the way, we'll invent a plugin API in case you need one. You write a really small thing and then write a bunch of plugin APIs and then write the rest of your framework on that. And then if somebody wants to do something else, it doesn't require like, oh, I wonder if somebody might want to do something special. Let's try to like add modularity in. It's just, well, you know, if you don't want to use that thing, we just happen to use our own plugin API for that, so go to town. And I think it's hard. It's really, really, really hard. It's a lot of temptation to just be like, well, it's all my own code. I'll just make a secret thing here that no one else is supposed to use. Only I'm allowed to use this. But when you do that, of course, you're then forced to give the people who want to do the same thing differently their own magic API. So, yeah, this applies both in good JavaScript code and good Ruby code. Is just expect people to write the same code that you write. Don't do anything special.
I'll come out and say right now that one of my demos in my talk tomorrow, I added a secret API in my framework so that it would work, because I don't have the problems all completely solved, so I'm definitely guilty of that.
Oh, the shade.
Okay. I was basically wanting to echo what you just said, and also emphasize that allowing people to write tests for their plugins and also for their application itself is essential, because if you do deprecate something, they have to know about it. So, like, well, you know, if a Rails application is well tested and Rails changes for some reason, or like a new version of some other plugin like removes like string.reverse or something, you would be able to catch it. So being able to simplify developing tests for your application developers is crucial as well. With RSpec, it's a little bit different because it's like, I don't know, I guess you are kind of writing tests for your tests by writing the tests in the first place, but I don't know.
Could you be more meta here? Okay, we have a question back here. Or did you have an answer?
I just want to say something. I mean, like with GitHub's fork queue, one of the how many of you have ever seen the movie Bruce Almighty? With Bruce Willis, where he becomes God and then he gets all the emails and he just says yes, 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 right? It's like what?
Jim Carrey.
Oh, Jim Carrey. Bruce Willis. Anyway,
Bruce Willis is God.
That'll be the third one. Anyway, yeah. I mean, like with the GitHub fork queue, it's so easy to just be like, yeah, I accept all this patch, you know, and then it's like you get these flood of patches, and it's hard because you don't want to say no to people, you know, but you're also trying to protect your framework as well. So I mean, that's another challenge.
Okay, we have a question back here.
Have you guys ever ran into a situation where you wanted to overload a method?
Yeah. Can you clarify what you mean by that?
You know, just it's not allowed.
I think the word overload is overloaded.
Well, there's overwritten and then there's overload, and overload is not allowed by. It's when you're in the same class and you call the exact same method name.
You mean having one method that supports different kinds of arguments?
Yeah, but it's the same method name. Like there's two method names in the same class. Yeah, Mats doesn't support that, so I was curious.
Doesn't everyone do that? I think I'm missing something.
Yeah. Oh.
Well, I think what he's talking about is arity.
So like star args or.
Hashes for Ruby. Yeah.
That doesn't work in. Oh, we want to do it?
Yeah, it's curious if you've done like something where you wanted to do it but couldn't.
I think I can sort of address that, which is that like the C code I both write and generate does that all the time, and I really hate it. Like I would much rather, like I would not like to have like 15 versions of each method that just because it like pass the type through and stuff like that. And I would really like to not ever have that in Ruby.
I'm gonna say yeah, because I've sometimes I get really annoyed because you need to use option hashes to accomplish that without using something like parse tree, and I know you got the Merb plugin does that with like the controllers and stuff, which is really cool. But the traditional way for us to do it is with option hashes, right? And I've recently got into doing Erlang and with tail recursion and all that stuff. And then I fell in love with that. So now there's times where I'm writing recursive stuff and I'm like, man, I really wish I could just like change the arity on this. It would be so much easier. But
I like it in Erlang. I don't know about it in Ruby.
Yeah, once in a while I want it, but almost every time someone asks me the question, I say, it's really easy. Like the way you do it in Ruby in the normal case where you don't feel like you need it is really elegant, and have like where you can just do star args or use an options hash or a million techniques or optional arguments. I feel like if people were able to do overloading, they would not use optional arguments and would just have like 10 different methods because people would think that that's what you should do. So yeah, there's a couple of cases where I felt, I really wish I could, have 3 different methods here, but it's really easy to implement that by having one method that calls out to multiple methods.
Yeah, protected methods or something.
And I'm seriously afraid of the types of Ruby code that would be created if you were just because people do what people come to Ruby from other languages, and if there's an equivalent to an idiom they're used to, they'll just do it. And I don't want to see that Ruby code.
Yeah. Also, methods in Ruby are an object as well. So if you pull out this method object and then call unbind or remove it or undef it or whatever, which one did you remove? So you have to then have the arity assigned to the concept of a method, and then you start looking like Erlang basically with their function literal syntax.
Right, so, and MacRuby has there's methods actually contain all the selectors. So actually, how do you undefine that? It becomes hard to figure out. And Ruby is really good at being guessable. I bet you undef method does that. That sounds right. Whereas if you start adding a lot of complexity, figuring out what would likely be the right thing becomes much harder.
Okay, we're up in the balcony now. Hi, folks. Got a question up here.
Actually, it's a good follow-up to that. As framework developers, how do you feel about the proliferation of language implementations?
Totally badass.
There's RAD can never work with any of them besides MRI because of Ruby to C. Whenever I talk to those guys whenever I mention trying to do that in another implementation, they say really mean things to me, the Seattle RB guys. So
I'm pretty excited about the amount of effort that's going into competing implementations of MRI. It's really fun to follow, but yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I think people got burned by JavaScript, honestly. So I think what we've done right is really hold all the implementations to a high standard of compatibility that so far has actually worked, as far as I can tell. It didn't take a lot of work to get JRuby running on Rails, and the JRuby guys are spend significant amounts of time making sure it works with Rails and Merb, and if someone reported a Sinatra or any other thing that's supposed to run on JRuby, they would work on it. And it's just up to us to continue holding them to a really high standard of compatibility. And if we do that and what I've personally been afraid of about proliferation is that we'll have to have code like in JavaScript that's if you're in Java, then do this other crazy shit because it doesn't work correctly and hacks around bugs. So far, that has not happened. So as long as that keeps being the case, I'm going to agree that it's kick-ass.
I actually saw I can't remember the name of it, but I did see a library on GitHub that just kind of came across my feed, and it actually had, if you're in JRuby, import com dot blah, 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 blah. So, and that was kind of
Yeah. I actually don't I think it's okay if what you're doing is you're importing Java's concurrent hash because the Ruby concurrent hash implementation is a hack we were just talking about. That's fine. What's not fine is MRI behavior that just doesn't work right in JRuby, so you have to write multiple if statements to try to hack around bugs in various implementations. So far, that has not happened.
Or there could be a library that fixes it, literally fixes bugs kind of in JRuby.
Right. I don't want jQuery or prototype for Ruby.
Okay, we have any other questions here? Okay, up front.
Yeah.
This could be tricky.
Talking about community portion, somebody mentioned GitHub and everything's moving to GitHub, and I'm trying to figure out, is that because Chris and the guys who wrote GitHub, or is it that they're on Ruby, or did Linus and Linux move to it? And why is everyone moving to it? It didn't exist a year and a half ago. I mean, it's great, but I'm just trying to understand the phenomenon.
GitHub for me was I had done the first kind of few versions of RAD, and I had this list of features I wanted to do, and then I got really busy with work stuff, and I hadn't worked on it in a few months, and then I got this ping from this guy, JD Barnhart, up in Seattle, and he said, hey, so you just stick RAD on GitHub so that I can, get at it? I think I got some ideas. And then And a month later, he issued a pull request that had done all my work for the last 6 months. Like all the features I was planning on implementing were done, and my framework was jumped this huge amount forward. He built the first version of the plugin architecture. He got the hooks, the preprocessor hooks into Ruby to C, and a bunch of stuff that got me started on stuff. Just that the power of that completely sold me. That happened the beginning of last year or whatever, and the power of that completely sold me on GitHub forever. So.
I think it was. I learned about it through Chris, and it was actually day one of writing Sinatra. It was really weird. But he was pushing to my Subversion repo from this really weird command line tool, and I was like, "What is that?" And he's like, "Oh, it's called Git. It's amazing. It's the new hotness. You got to see it. It's just totally awesome." So I was like, "Okay." So then I installed that, and then we started working with it. But anyway, it's got all those rich features. But I think the big sell for me was watching Linus's Google Talk, and he's got godlike status to all of us, So I think a lot of us just wanted to follow and that kind of in their footsteps. And then, GitHub was a huge contribution to that.
I'm less excited, actually, by Git than I am by GitHub. I think GitHub would be possible with other distributed version control systems. It would not be possible with something like Subversion. But I think the main benefit of GitHub is really the social network that's around it. So someone said, I can't remember who it was, they said that whenever you put code on GitHub, you're not creating an open source project. You're just sort of sharing your code out there. That's actually something relatively new to the open source world, and that it allows people to just not have to worry about being an open source project manager. They're just sort of here it is, guys, and people can follow other people and see, oh, he just pushed, oh, what's this? Oh, let me write a blog post. Oh, and suddenly the community knows about it. It's on GitHub, and people can say oh, this is his GitHub username, and they know exactly how to find it. So I think that is the social network, the ability to watch people, the ability to fork and then submit patches. I've noticed a very tangible impact on the Adhearsion project whenever I switched over to GitHub. Before, the number of patches were mostly trivial patches to Adhearsion, few and far between. And then whenever I switched to GitHub, people could go to the network and sort of see all the other people contributing to it. And so, I actually had a big uptick in non-trivial patches, and it's I think it's totally revolutionized the way open source software is produced. That's huge. Totally huge.
I think in people's effort to get people to switch from, originally to get people to switch from Subversion to Git, they made the error of saying, well, you could use Git kind of like Subversion. Here's the Git clone. It's kind of like SVN CI. Yay. And there's a lot of actually, so Merb originally was in Subversion. Merb 0.9 actually started, was a pretty complete rewrite. It started on Git, and there's definitely, I'll reiterate that it was a world of difference between Git and Subversion, but the real big thing about Git, and agreed that GitHub is awesome, but the thing about distributed version control systems is that you actually could have people that have their own copies of your repo and make changes and constantly pull from master. Honestly, we just did a pretty massive merge from work that I did for over 3 months back into Rails with 3 months of divergence, and it wasn't fun, but it would not have been possible Subversion. I just would have went home and cried. And we did it over 2 days. We wrote a tool that basically went through every commit, and if it was not an action pack or action mailer commit, automatically committed it, and if it was an action pack or action mailer commit, did it a Git show and allowed us to do any one of the Git merge, various merge strategies, and we worked out that, okay, we can do Git merge minus S hours, which will automatically make us win, and a whole bunch of Git things that are, because we're doing it distributed, that just aren't possible Subversion. And I think it's hard to explain if you're not actually involved in the process, but the fact that people could have forks and, leave for a month on vacation and come back, and I'll sometimes be like, hey, that Merb thing doesn't apply cleanly, can you rebase? I would never have said that to somebody who made a Subversion patch, because the actual act of rebasing a patch is nightmarish on Subversion. But in Git, it's usually just git rebase ycat/merb or something, and it usually works. And if it doesn't work, there's a conflict, then it's easy to fix. So it's just designed for distributed versioning, and we're doing that. And GitHub is awesome. I don't want to reiterate why GitHub is awesome, but distributed version control, we could have used Mercurial probably just fine, but actually not being on Subversion I think had a fairly massive impact on the Ruby open source community, and it's another small evolutionary makes small evolutionary steps possible.
Okay. I think we got time for only just like one or two more questions, so let's try. I'm way back here, over here. Okay, so Andre?
So mine's a quick one. What do you think we can do to get the community moved to Ruby 1.9?
Get Rails on 1.9.
Why do you want the community to be on Ruby 1.9?
I mean, there's some pretty significant speed increases if you're doing something that's actually computationally intensive in Ruby. And one example is an active record include where you really actually have a lot of dependent objects. There's some pretty major speed up there.
So I think there's basically two options for speed right now. You can use JRuby, you can use 1.9. I probably do more benchmarking than anybody in the Ruby community, and I've noticed some really weird, like how come rendering that ERB template is 14 times slower than 1.8 in like some random cases. And I think if you're doing something really computationally intensive, you might want to use 1.9. For sure, if you're doing like scripting that is computationally intensive, because then JRuby is not a good option. Or if you're doing something that requires C extensions for which an FF5 version didn't come out yet. But 1.9 actually has if you bench I bench like everything. Every time I do a new thing, I'm like, I wonder how that performs across every single Ruby VM, and I bench it. And there's really weird 1.9 behavior occasionally, where usually it's my overall results are 1.9 is about twice as fast as 1.8, and JRuby is about 2.5 times faster than 1.8. But 1.9 has really weird outlining blips of really slowness. So I think we need to encourage people to look at all the implementations and find ones that work. But yeah, I think the premise of there would be a huge community benefit for being on 1.9 is not obvious.
Yeah, and I think gem compatibility and JRuby compatibility are, I think, the two big things. There's a website that's like, is it 1.9 yet? Is that it? Yeah. That sort of automatically tests gems out on gem servers to see if they're Ruby 1.9 compatible with the test pass, which doesn't necessarily mean if they're 1.9 compatible. But we've got ourselves into an interesting rut, I think, in the Ruby community, because there's so much gem code out there written basically for 1.8.6, Yeah, and it's I think that people should sort of write code with the expectation that it's going to run on many interpreters, and the Ruby community really hasn't sort of had that forced down their throat. But also, for me with the Adhearsion framework, I don't want to switch to 1.9 yet, irrespective of the gems, because maybe you could be 1.9 and 1.8 compatible and then not use some gems for 1.9. But it's still, if I switch over to 1.9 syntax, I would break JRuby compatibility. And for me, Java's a big thing in the telephony world. So JRuby has to be an option at all times. So, I'm sure JRuby will get there. They had parser support, I think, in their last release. And I think, they'll, within 6 months.
Yeah, it should work for most things.
Does it work now, pretty much, with the switch? Yeah, so it's getting there, and maybe whenever that comes out, there will be more impetus to get all of the gems compatible. So those, I think, are my two big issues.
I think this is a great job for a duplex proxy.
I also want to say I think we should get our gems like that rambling thing that I said before. This should not indicate that I don't think it's good for us to make Ruby 1.9 a possibility. I just think it's not like the shiny new hotness, but we should all be trying to make sure that our code runs on as many Ruby interpreters as possible.
Okay, guys. I think we got to wrap up now. It's been really interesting, and thank you very much for coming and sitting all on stage together for us. And let's give them all a big hand.